first became friends, we knew each other from Petaluma maybe a tiny bit, but we had a really fantastic experience and came back and just like dove in, and Pete has just really dedicated the rest of his life to addressing this issue. So take it away, Pete, our climate hero.
Can you see my screen?
We did, and then it went away.
Okay, yeah. Well, let me try again.
Okay. Well, thank you. It really feels good to be among friends, some of whom I know and some of whom I don't. When everybody was doing introductions, I was reminded of something I remember reading that Bill McKibben had written years ago, saying that addressing climate change will require an effort on the scale of the effort that put a man on the moon, but this time we have to put everybody on the moon. And that's just, it stayed with me. And that's what I guess impels me to want to get these ideas out, get an understanding of climate issues out to a much wider community. Anyway, so I'll give you a little bit of self-intro in just a little bit. I haven't rehearsed this whole performance, so I don't know exactly how long it's going to take, but I'm going to go through pretty quickly. So let me just start by setting the context, by reminding us all that we are at a crossroads of unfathomable import, a transition point in the history of our species and the history of our planet. Next, please. We are confronted by multiple crises, both human and environmental. The delicate web of life is fraying. The sixth mass extinction of species, planetary boundaries breached, tipping points crossed, atmospheric CO2 50% higher than at any time in our brief residence on Earth. Climate chaos. You don't need me to remind you of all these things, but I just wanted to put that out there as the context for an effort to imagine a different future. So next slide. So here's a handy dandy graphic representation of our greenhouse gas challenge. So the red line indicates the path that we've been on. This is just Petaluma's activity-based emissions. The blue line is what current California law suggests. The purple line is Jerry Brown's 2018 pledge. And the green line is what our city has pledged, net zero emissions by 2030. And very clearly, you can see that there is a discontinuity at 2020 or 2021, where we are now. So this is a great turning point. Next slide. Oh, I forgot I put this in. This is just to suggest that if we had started 30 years ago, we wouldn't be facing such a steep and perilous slope. But we've all been asleep at the wheel, so here we are. Next slide. We are usually advised to downplay the grim reality because we know that fear causes our brains to shut down. Acknowledging that, I would suggest instead that in order to respond to an emergency, we have to acknowledge our inconvenient reality. Next slide. So this slide encompasses my whole story. I don't know, I can't really explain why, but it's just kind of fun and whimsical, and there are some buildings in it. I'm an architect by training. I first came across the limits to growth study when I was in architecture school. And that planted a seed in my head that has just remained. I taught green and sustainable building at Sonoma State and Academy of Art University for years. And over the course of that time, energy and climate issues slowly and steadily migrated to the top of the heap. And were just on the threshold of consuming all of my passions and energies. I did Climate Ride in 2011, went to New York City for the Climate March in 2014, 2017 Climate Reality Leadership. I've been reading lots of books and reports and classes. I'm not a climate scientist. I see part of my role as translating the work of the climate science community and the broader scientific community to a wider audience. I'm a translator in a way. Next slide. So my own big emotional slap in the head came in, I think it was 2016. I was on a wintertime ski trip with my son, a driving trip in a motor vehicle. And at the same time, I happened to be reading a book called Deep, A History of Skiing and the End of Winter. And realizing that my observations of negligible snowpack in the middle of winter were evidence of what I was reading, the reality that winter is slowly going away. And it may not seem like much, but to me, winter has always been this amazing, magical, otherworldly time. And to think that that is going away just really rattled me to my core. Next slide. Some years ago, I was struck by the realization that we collectively don't have a plan. We don't have a shared vision of where we're going. And as someone trained as an architect, I found this little oversight really hard to fathom. In my own work, at the beginning of larger design projects, I would often write out a list of goals or values that would guide the project. Things like minimize the amount of water that is needed on an ongoing basis, or make fullest use of the nutrients in wastewater, and stuff like that. And the design process then takes off from a statement of those values. And architects and designers are supposed to be able to imagine physical things that don't yet exist and then bring them from idea into reality. This is something that we should be able to do. But on the scale of our municipalities, we do nothing of the kind. Yes, we have general plans, but in my experience of them, they all seem to be written in language that's so carefully chosen to avoid disagreement that they really don't have much meaning. Next slide. From our Petaluma general plan, things like maintain a close-knit, neighborly, and family-friendly city, foster and promote economic diversity and opportunities, ensure infrastructure is strengthened and maintained. No objections, that all sounds great, but what's our vision? What's our vision of the future? Moving toward a future without a vision is kind of like setting off on a long road trip without a destination or even without a roadmap. So if we don't know where we're going, we have to measure progress by looking at the speedometer, which is exactly what economic indicators like the Dow and NASDAQ and Sonoma County Economic Outlook are. They don't indicate progress, they just tell us how fast we're going. And that's crazy. Next slide. Unless we take the time to say otherwise, we're destined to continue on our current path. We will be propelled by inertia, by momentum. The path that we're now on is characterized by an addiction to more, bigger, and faster. We're enthralled to endless growth made possible by ever-increasing use of fossil energy. These addictions can be seen in our vehicles, our buildings, our communications, our food systems, everywhere. Next slide. The prevailing approach to land use is largely invisible to many of us, I think to the majority of people, because it's all we know. but it can be described as sprawl. Next slide. The two defining characteristics of sprawl are dominance of the automobile and isolationist or segregationist zoning. And we've taken this to the next level. Not only do we separate incompatible uses, but we separate compatible uses, like single family residential from multifamily residential. Next slide. The basic building blocks of sprawl are housing subdivisions, shopping centers, business parks, civic buildings, and lots of roads needed to connect the other four pieces. But we have to remember that the way we live now, our current path, is a radical departure from the way humans have lived forever. Next slide. In the early 1800s, most Americans lived on farms in small towns and villages. Next slide. Algonquin, Maine. Next slide. Montpelier, Vermont. Next slide. The largest cities were small, dense, and compact. A typical small town, next slide, was a few blocks long and a few blocks wide. At the center of town was the center of town, where we would expect to find city hall, banks, bars, hotels, stores, liveries, workshops, houses, all loosely arranged according to unwritten but widely understood patterns of what a town should be. Next slide. And traffic moved at a pedestrian pace. So these are the places that we visit when we go on vacation, because we love them, even if we don't understand why we love them. Places like Nantucket and Charleston and Santa Fe and all the historic old towns throughout the country. So I'm leaving out how we got from there to here, but suffice it to say that here we are. We're headed down a road that places transient private gain above our health and the health of our Mother Earth, the air, the water, the soil, the biosphere. The time has come for us to get back on the path toward an equitable, resilient, carbon-free future. So let's try to describe that future. Next slide. Let's start with agriculture. In this shorthand Cliff Notes version of a vision of the future, all farming is small scale, local, and organic. No aquifer depletion, no topsoil loss, no fertilizer runoff. There's a greater reliance on plant calories and less meat. We practice carbon sequestration on a massive scale. No toxins, no fertilizer runoff, zero food waste, zero transportation emissions. Food is healthy. Next slide. In the realm of forestry and other land uses, reforestation and restoration have replaced deforestation. All working forests are managed as complete ecosystems. No clear cutting, no tree farms. Degraded lands are restored to optimum health and biodiversity. Soil health is paramount. Next slide. Our towns and cities have the feel of older towns and cities that came into existence when traffic moved at a pedestrian pace. Next slide.
It's not.
Oh.
I
Okay.
don't have a next slide.
Oh, really?
Nope. Oh, wait a minute. There we go.
Whoa, there's one.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry.
Can we try one more? Yes.
All right.
Streets for people. Smart growth principles guide all development. Compact, dense towns and cities. Cities surrounded by greenbelt open space which is available for food production, wild nature, recreation. All of our streets are pedestrian and bike friendly. There is a wide range of public transit available. Our community members are relieved of the responsibility to own their own motor vehicles, and zoning is mixed. So we're returning to an earlier time when uses were liberally mixed. Life was lively and chaotic without being unsafe. Next slide. And towns and cities leads into transportation. Back one, Annie. Thanks. Changes in other areas result in a greatly reduced need for transportation. All motorized transportation is electric, everything. Aviation and transoceanic freight are still not yet solved. We have work to do. We have much work to do. Next slide. In the realm of buildings, which is something that I'm supposed to know something about, all new buildings are built using low embodied carbon materials produced locally or regionally. Buildings require no more energy for their ongoing operation than can be generated renewably, ideally on site. Not always possible. All existing buildings have been retrofitted to the same standard. Next slide. And as a subjective note, buildings are designed with durability, reuse, and repairability in mind. Next slide. All electricity is clean and renewable, relying mainly on wind, water, and solar. So we're done with fracking, mountaintop removal, oil spills, natural gas explosions, smog, and wars fought to defend our national energy interests. We have more smaller local utilities and microgrids. And we have more ways of storing electricity: batteries, compressed air, molten salts, water storage, and others. Next slide. Industry, which is a bit invisible to many of us. Industry is guided by life cycle cradle to cradle thinking, circular rather than linear patterns of production. Reuse and recycling are standard practices. Constant efforts at increasing production efficiencies yield ongoing benefits. Fuel switching replaces fossil fuels with clean electricity. And long distance transportation of materials and goods is minimal in defiance of global everything. Next slide. And on the realm of people, because we have to put everybody on the moon, all people understand the need to nurture the biosphere that sustains us. This understanding results in care for the earth and for each other, in localization of everything, in less selfish behavior, and less need for stuff. Next slide. All of these efforts yield uncountable other benefits: meaningful employment, local control, greater neighborliness, reduced waste, clean air and water, healthy soil, carbon sequestration, human psychological benefits, and on and on. It's a win-win-win. Next slide. And because not all that counts can be counted, it's appropriate to end with values. Next slide. Our journey to this hoped-for future world must be guided by love and compassion. In the words of the Dalai Lama, be kind whenever possible. It is always possible. That's it. Thank you. Next slide. That's all I got.
Thank you so much, Pete.
Oh, I also wanted to say this. You know, I could maybe start or contribute to a little bit of a discussion by saying that I've been a part of an effort to try to put together a crowdsourced vision of a carbon neutral, equitable, resilient Sonoma County. And it's in the form of a website. The address is Imagine Sonoma County. And it's kind of up in beta version. It's rough and clunky, but it's gotten some good reviews, and I think there is potential there to at very least get these ideas out there and percolating amongst a wider community. So yeah, so Natasha put it in the chat, imaginesenomacounty.org or .com, sorry, .com. I'll leave it there.
Is it .com? I thought it was .org.
I think .com.
Should check.
.com.
Yeah, only one of the two will work.
There you go. Pete, that was really amazing. Sadly, my internet cut out right in the middle for a second, so I caught most of it. Luckily, it's being recorded.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you and I have talked a lot about this, about how do we know where we're going? How do you build a house without having any vision of what that house is going to look like?
Yeah.
And so what we were hoping to do is use this forum, use Pete's talk as like a jumping off point for maybe a little group discussion about, how we can take this, how we can further this in our community, how we can further this discussion, how we can brainstorm some ideas and maybe run with them so that we turn this into not just a presentation, but something that motivates some action. So I don't know if anybody has any thoughts that came up, things during Pete's presentation that got you excited or that, inspired you. Or Pete, if you have any ideas that came up from Imagine Sonoma County that you'd like to share, like some creative ideas that people have come up with.
Yeah, I'm just going to take a step back for now and let anybody else make a comment.
Anybody feeling inspired?
Well, I think
Blake, you must have some ideas about the whole roads part, right? Like how we connect all of these things and all the transportation issues. I'm gonna make you get us started about like how could we re-envision how transportation works?
oh, I do have thoughts on
It's
that.
okay if I put you on the spot.
No, it's fine. But I was actually, I have one point I want to jump to before that, because
Great.
I love the imagery of not being able to know where you go till you know what you want the house to look like. In our case, though, and I'm thinking on a narrow band here, but just thinking about Petaluma, it feels a little more like we have a Frankenstein house that was built over time, and now we're trying to figure out what we want the house to be, and the contractors have all left, and we have to figure out what was finished and left undone, and what's been put there. And I was thinking so much about the amazing work that the Climate Action Commission has done in terms of what the changes should come. I was also thinking, just as a visual person, it would be, and maybe this is something I've missed that's already been out there, but it would be so helpful to see, like, I'm thinking in terms of a map, but just an understanding of here's where all our problem points are. And that's a horribly vague statement in itself, but just thinking, like, to Pete's point about being honest about our problem, not trying to scare people, but just being honest about, we have too much asphalt. We have a road network that doesn't make any sense on the best of days. we have these subdivisions out here that create these traffic flow issues. Like being able to have that kind of assessment, whether that's from the city or the public, just to see what could we replace it with? What could the community crowdsource around where it's, oh, hey, that's a community garden effort. Or this is we gotta put a kind of pin on this for when we could get control of this land again one day to redevelop if that ever becomes possible. Or I'm kind of speaking a little more vague, but that's just been what was on my mind throughout the presentation, because so much of this house has been built. And I think the struggle for people becomes, okay, well, what do we do? The neighborhoods are here already, right? So just being able to identify those targets and then to be able to go, okay, what can we do from the community? So it's, it's not all the city, it's not all government, but what we can do together. But on the roads front, or not on the roads front, but on the transit front, I think so much has already been said. I mean, even in the last meeting, that is helpful. I think folks have brought up in the past efforts to include more electric bikes, efforts to move away from traditional large buses. I think what's great is the federal government's finally starting to shift to electric, to being able to allow you to actually purchase electric buses as a city and have those grants actually qualify. So I think being able to invest in smaller kind of pocket buses, being able to invest in more malleable routes that vary a bit so that it's, yeah, you have your core corridors, but you also are able to kind of offshoot into areas where people are clustered, especially on the west side of town. And then honestly, building up all those multimodal connections, especially because, it's easy to say, yeah, we finally aligned schedules, we finally expanded bus routes, but then you've got people who are trying to get to work, or they're trying to get through their day. And how do you make being on a bike or getting, from bike to bus to train and back? How do you make all of that easy enough that, one, they're not having to take a shower at some point in that discussion, but then the other thing is, how do you make it easy enough that it is, a second thought for them? So that's, in terms of reimagining, I think so much of it becomes, how do we make it easier for not just people who are passionate about being able to get on their bike or being able to walk around town, but easier for everybody else who has to go to the store, has to get their groceries, has to pick up their kids. Because once we can nail that, the rest of this becomes a lot easier, because for people, it's all about convenience when it comes to transit. So I'll stop
I
there.
love your idea, Blake, of the mapping out, because I'm also a visual person, sort of mapping out what the problems are and where our pain points are and what's already existing. And one of the things I always think about is the 3 p.m. School pickup traffic jam that kind of takes over town.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if they actually, there's the whole safe routes to school, which has not created any route that you could actually bike down to school. But I'd be curious to see a map of where people are going to and coming from and going to, and how could we change that, either with actually having school buses again, or having actual safe routes to school where they're pedestrian and bike friendly. But it would be interesting to see that as a visual presentation.
Yeah, and it would be great to get groups involved to help with, I don't want to say the data recording, but to help with the kind of surveying to get how people are actually, to your point, using bike lanes, traveling around, what issues they're running into. Because it's great that the city will send out an email survey, but that's such a small percentage of people actually responding or seeing that. It'd be great to see community groups involved in that effort too.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else have any thoughts they want to share?
Laura has her hand up, and I think I saw Eileen earlier.
Oh yeah, Laura, the hand up thing. Yeah. Forgot about that.
I was just, oh, did you call on me? Sorry.
Yeah, go Laura. Go ahead, Laura. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I was on the conversation about the general plan last night for Santa Rosa. And it was exactly what Pete described. It was motherhood and apple pie. And I don't think the word climate is anywhere in there. And in a breakout group, all of the community members that were in the group wanted actually to have this conversation that we're having tonight and really push the developers of the plan towards, you know, adding climate in and having a richer conversation about how funds were allocated between, in particular, schools and police force. And it was a really great conversation. So my question really would be, how do we facilitate these conversations community-wide? I mean, is there a way to bring this approach back into a general planning process, or, you know, into a community conversation process that's broader than the climate community, and also then eventually brings in, I would say brings in elected officials, but, you know, hat tip to Brian for being here as part of this conversation. So, wonder about your ideas for that.
Anybody here want to respond to that? My first thought was the Measure M parks. Is that what it was, Linda? When the city did that parks workshop, the turnout was fantastic, and the enthusiasm, and they literally had the maps, you know, for everyone to look at and draw on, and, you know, the different tables, and you would switch tables, and that was actually, you know, it had a really great format. I know, you know, COVID has changed the ability to engage like that with the community. But I know what you mean, Lauren. It seems to be a hard thing for people to figure out, is how to get a nice, diverse population at the table, discussing these bigger picture ideas, and really kind of brainstorming and kind of getting out of our own way of like, well, what was has to be in the future. Like, how do we get super creative about what can be? Anybody else have an answer to that question?
Pete has his hand.
I think part of it is not talking about climate too. Is that talking about quality of life, talking about things that, you know, you don't even have to talk about climate to address things.
Nobody likes
Like
to be stuck
spent,
in that traffic jam. Yeah.
Exactly. I literally spent 30 minutes before I got on this call talking with Catherine Palmer at the Argus about why all of a sudden safe streets is an issue. And like after the solidarity ride, or the ride of silence a couple of nights ago for the people who've been hit by cars on bikes last night, she was like, you know, has this linkage between street safety and cycling always been there? Like, it's always been there, you know. Just people, you know, if you start talking about, you know, safety, you hit people who have mothers, people who have children that are riding their bikes on the street or walking down the street. You don't always have to talk about climate.
Pete's got an answer too.
Yeah, well, one thing is that the county, I think the RCPA or SCTA has their Vision Zero plan, which is intended to reduce traffic fatalities to zero. And the kind of things that they recommend: slowing traffic, making streets safe for bicycles and pedestrians. No mention of climate, but all the other reasons to do all of these things. And I also wanted to say that one of the things that I got at the Climate Action Commission meeting the other night, the general plan consultant suggested that they will be hosting or focused on visioning in summer and fall of this year. And I don't know what the format of those visioning sessions will be, but it seems like it's a perfect opportunity for us as community members to show up and make our voices heard.
I know, Eileen, you had your hand up earlier. I don't know if you wanted to jump in.
Sure. So I really liked your talk, Pete. I just was wondering,
Me too.
it's a very ambitious vision. And I'm just wondering what your vision is for getting from where we are now to where we want to be. What is the whole point of getting this out there when we don't really know what the plan is for that?
You know, I'd say it's a great question. I would say that the first step is envisioning where we want to get to, and the second step is figuring out how to get from here to there. Because what we're largely doing now is we're piecemealing. We're looking at policies and actions in a very fragmented way, without a sense of where we want to end up. And that
It'd be like having the plumber just doing his thing and the electrician doing her thing, and like, you know, trying to create a building that made sense at the end, but nobody was coordinated. No one knew what the shared goal was.
In that analogy, maybe each of the tradespeople is given the direction to just make things better, you know, fix things, keep things from breaking, and everybody does their own thing, but there's no central purpose. But really, that's kind of a long-winded, lame answer, because figuring out the policies that will get us from here to that ideal world of 2030, it takes a lot of diligent thinking that I myself have not yet engaged in. You know, what will really get us all the way? But that's the conversation that we need to be engaged in.
Eric's got his hand up there.
Sorry, I don't have an electronic hand to raise.
What, you have to use the old-fashioned kind?
Anyway, thank you. I'm new, so I don't. I do really love to listen, but I did have a thought in the conservation space that I've been working in. It's struck me unusually so in climate conversations that there's some very different constituencies with very radically different views that I found in no other topic other than climate and conservation. You can find these very deep pathways towards consensus. And so an example is and the kind of work that I've spent time in the outdoor recreation is with hunters, which when I first started this, I couldn't even imagine or fathom how you would get a hunter involved in conservation. And lo and behold, as I did my learning, it was an amazing experience to hear once you got through all this quite vitriolic politic layer, quite often you could get to these very harmonious thinking about what it really means to, you know, preserve our land, why it's important. A lot of the same conversations with very different words, right? And it really taught me anyway that I think something that's missing a lot in these conversations is just the ability to sit with a group, especially groups that you might be very uncomfortable with, as long as it's safe, of course, and then to hear and listen and to try to figure out what's that vocabulary people are saying, and if it's making me react viscerally, why, and how can I get through that to say, sounds like we have a common point.
Eric, that's so true and so right. And I've had that experience as well, where if you really get to know somebody, even if it seems like you have, you know, very different political views, as you know, easily can divide us. But when you boil it down to what you're actually trying to say, you're using different words, but you actually have the same end goal or the same meaning behind them so often. And so, yes, that being able to have those conversations beyond sort of the normal sphere that we would include as already being on board. I think that's great, the work you're doing. I'd love to hear more about the Trouts Unlimited sometime too. We should connect.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And in case anybody didn't see it in the chat, and Lisa, who has lost her voice, said that she put a link in there. She said that in France, they they have bicycle buses for the kids, which sounds, you know, that idea of sort of making it more fun than the alternative, I think is really great. So. Anybody else have any inspiration or ideas? Beverly.
I think some inspiration or idea that I had listening to everyone and having participated in the Measure M visioning session and then experiencing the back end of that, I realized how critical it is to educate our elected officials. It feels to me, at least my experience has been, like what our climate commission did was absolutely amazing. And now we actually have to go through all of our city management and help them understand how they can participate in that. And, you know, groups like ours, we're all on board, but perfect example, Slow Streets, we got maybe 8 and then disappeared. So that's kind of an education problem for, we look to government to do certain things and then it falls through the cracks or too hard or whatever it is, but it becomes somehow it now becomes the community's responsibility to educate our leaders so that we get the vision that they asked us to provide. So
That's actually a perfect segue, because I know we have just a couple minutes left in this portion of the meeting, and then we were going to kind of move on to our regular business, but we were hoping to kind of try to translate this into something actionable for 350 Petaluma. And Beverly, you just kind of gave me the idea that for the education part and sort of the community outreach part, and this will probably come up in the next half hour part of the meeting where we do a little more businessy stuff. But Annie and I were talking about, and I'm sure other people have also talked about, we've talked with other people about doing maybe tabling at farmers markets or other places in town where we could engage with community members. But it would be fun if we could figure out a way to sort of create that, even if it's only for 5 minutes, a creative environment where people can do sort of like the Measure M, like maybe we have maps of town and people can mark their pain points on it. Like, this is the place that drives me crazy and this is why, you know what I mean? And we can get some kind of conversation going and a record of it and get people activated in a different sort of way. So that would be kind of fun.
I like that. And I also want to make a pitch for, you know, the city has got, I don't know, 20 positions that are opening up on committees and commissions. And I think absolutely everybody who has one meeting per month that they can give to the city, this is the best absolute way for each and every one of us here who have passions about different things going on in the city to start infiltrating the government process so that the voices get heard. And the nice part of that is that, you know, we had Eric last night, who is absolutely wonderful, and his wife. And when it's recorded and you are on a dais and you're speaking and hearing and the community is engaged, I do think that it calls people forward to get more engaged. Otherwise, we vote them out. But that's another story.
I want to echo that. Please, yeah, I put the recruitment flyer for all the committees and commissions positions in the chat. So if you go to the chat, you can pull that down and you can find a place to plug yourself in. I believe they're due at the end of May. The applications aren't too onerous. Yeah, they're not too onerous. And the amount of time is it's not excessive. And we absolutely, it's so crucial that we have strong representation on these.
Yeah, I just redropped in the chat the link, city link to Brian, so it's at the
Great.
bottom there too.
Thanks.
And then I wanted to say too, in case people do drop off as we move, if you heard about this meeting through a friend or were invited but aren't on our newsletter, we are, we would love to have you on our mailing list just so that you can, know when the next meetings are. This meeting is every third Thursday, so you can just sort of mark your calendar with that. And then also on the 350 Petaluma website, Lance has created a fantastic calendar on the front that has all of these events. It has the city deadline on it. It has, important city meetings, the Know Before You Grow meetings. So we're in the works, but our goal is to sort of make 350petaluma.org the sort of one-stop shop for like seeing what's going on climate related. Ooh, monthly bike night. That sounds good, Brian. All right, so Annie, do you think we're so practically perfectly timed, 7:31.